Hello, bonjour. My name is Elyse Singer, and I'm speaking to you today from New York City, where I am a PhD candidate at the CUNY Graduate Center. I'm delighted to be participating in the 2020 Domitor Conference and to be sharing my paper entitled Methodologies for Madness: Instructions for Emotional Expression in Early Motion Picture Acting Manuals. In her 1913 handbook, Motion Picture Acting, Frances Agnew includes a catalog of emotions and sentiments that the aspiring photoplayer should practice before a mirror. The list begins with rejoicing, moves through tenderness with pity, and ends with madness. A journalist by trade with limited stage or screen acting credits, Agnew could not claim personal expertise in techniques for performing before the camera, no less methods for enacting characters in mental distress. Her advice in this concise book, pragmatically subtitled, How to Prepare for Photoplaying, What Qualifications Are Necessary, How to Secure an Engagement, Salaries Paid to Photoplayers, is based foremost on interviews with the leading players of her day. By the 1920s, there was a booming industry in how-to booklets and training programs related to screen acting in the United States and England. This paper focuses on methodologies surrounding the on-screen performance of madness and expression of mental distress as detailed in film acting instruction booklets published before 1923. In what ways did photoplaying instruction manual writers mimic or stray from the methods espoused in stage acting instructional texts, or dominant theatrical practices around the imitation of mania through gesture or facial expression? I will argue that the techniques proposed for learning motion picture acting in these manuals, all in the name of naturalness, served, in fact, to exacerbate stereotypical manifestations of mental distress. Advice on how to approach acting mad is as old as rhetoric itself. 2,000 years ago, Seneca the Elder cautioned in Controversiae that the orator Vibius Gallus lost his mind in trying to imitate insanity. Similarly, the English actor-manager Henry Siddons, writing in 1822 on the challenge of performing madness, advised prudence in lieu of rage that, quote, tears the hair in a frightful manner, which throws the whole visage into the distortions of grimace, which pants until every muscle swells, and the blood gushes up to the extended eyes, end quote. He adds, such a rage may perhaps be a true representation of nature, but it is very, very disgusting in the imitation. Siddons is concerned with decorum, but his description also alludes to a pre-Enlightenment understanding of hysteria as a visceral disorder. For actors, as Joseph Roach explains in The Player's Passions, Studies in the Science of Acting, this translated in keeping extreme emotions down, lest potentially lethal bodily fluids and forces rise up in the body. The question of bodily excess or spillage may also be seen as racialized and, as Rizvana Bradley notes, rooted in, quote, Eurocentric assumptions about the body and embodied expression, end quote. The distorted grimaces that Siddons discourages may also be seen as a proclivity to embellish when playing a mad role. Don't overact, Agnew exhorts. Be natural in all your portrayals, actually living the roles for the moment, of course. Natural actions and expressions are the secret of success on the screen. There's an emphasis on self-control, on eschewing unnecessary behavior. Hugo Munsterberg allows in The Photoplay, a psychological study, that the silent film actor may need to exaggerate expression to some degree to compensate for the lack of speech. He contrasts this with the mime, who demonstrates or exhibits emotion, pointing to it, and warns the photoplayer against such self-referentiality. In 1916, Sam Slapich, a columnist for Motion Picture Magazine, echoed this sentiment when proposing that actors, quote, must be able to depict the emotions without ranting, and this requires the highest art of this nature possible to obtain, end quote. Slapich does not specify mental distress in his essay on expressing emotions on the screen, which suggests looking to classical sculpture for the loftiest artistic representations of the upward of 180 classified emotions. But many of his contemporaries, including Francis Agnew, did conflate madness with emotion. Might this impulse to make madness visual in the early 20th century be residue from the highly theatricalized images of white female hysteria that circulated across representational media in the late 1800s? Disability culture activist Petra Kuppers suggests that hysteria may be seen as a central conflict of this period. At stake was the liberation of the neurological apparatus from the gynecological one, the mind from the body. Yet, during that same time, mind-body unification was at the essence of the acting practices that dominated European and American theater. Early screen acting instructional texts were modeled on the 19th century tradition of illustrated guides to theatrical gesture. These books, such as Siddons and Engel's Practical Illustrations of Rhetorical Gesture and Action, 1822, cataloged emotions with images of facial expressions and gestural poses said to represent inner sensations. While aimed at the aspiring actor or public speaker, gesture handbooks, often building off theoretical works by Diderot and Descartes, wrestled with philosophical questions related to the mechanics of acting and its conflict with true passions. It's important to note that the visual representations of embodied emotions in these books tend to focus on those that would occur in the most dramatic or conflict-filled moments. For example, of the nearly 70 illustrations in Practical Illustrations of Rhetorical Gesture and Action, only 2 or 3 are subdued, while the rest are heightened emotional states. Handbooks aimed predominantly at wannabe starlets utilize some of the same poetic language regarding truthful emotions, but tended to be more practical. They included instruction on hair and makeup, as well as addresses for managers and film studios, plus nuts and bolts advice for how to apply for acting jobs. Moreover, while the gestural guides lean towards the embodiment of heightened passions, the illustrated expressions in the photoplayer literature tend to represent more nuanced or combinations of expressions and mental conditions. Jean Bernique's 1916 book, Motion Picture Acting for Professionals and Amateurs, features a haunting still of American actress Clara Kimball Young, 1890 to 1960, from the 1915 film Trilby, to show, quote, dementia, stupor, sorrow, remorse, grief, melancholia, end quote. Emotions and psychiatric symptoms are aligned here as if equivalently conveyed by her visible expression. As many of the authors stress in their photoplayer instruction texts, acting for the camera focuses on facial expression, particularly the eyes, to convey emotion. The performance seen by the spectators, moreover, is subject to the editing of the director. Stage acting calls upon the actor to convey character through voice, bodily movement, as well as physical gesture, often to an audience of thousands of spectators, including those seated in the second balcony. French acting coach François Delsart, 1811 to 1871, is a key transitional figure between 19th century acting instruction books and early guides to screen acting. Delsart visited morgues, prisons, and asylums as part of his embodied research and in creating his movement-based aesthetical science system, which would later influence modern dancers including Isadora Duncan and Ruth St. Denis. While he did not publish his writings during his lifetime, A virtual industry emerged in the late 19th and early 20th century in England and the US of books and elocution programs based on his method. Many focused more on the Delsarte system's applicability to exercise, vocal training, and movement than as a method for dramatic performance or public speaking per se. For example, Genevieve Stebbins' 1886 Delsarte system of dramatic expression emphasizes its application for pantomime, physical culture, and statue posing. Delsarte's disciples stressed that gesture was a physical manifestation of inner life. Edward B. Warman, it describes in Gestures and Attitudes an exposition of the Delsarte philosophy of expression. Quote, Delsarte's philosophy is the philosophy of expression. Quote, Delsarte's philosophy is the philosophy of expression, the revelation of the inward by the outward agencies. Everything we produce is merely the form of what exists in our mind. End quote. It should be noted that the mind here and in other Delsarte-inspired texts, with a few exceptions, is presumed to be healthy. Delsarte believed that bodily expressions, such as gestures, needed to be internally motivated, but that they could also be codified physically. In one sense, the systematizing and reproduction of the coded gesture was a sign of mechanization, but he stressed that the spiritual idea behind it was key. The expression of the inward or internal through gesture was interpreted by some Delsartians as embodying the language of emotion or soul, the articulation of the language of reason. End quote. But yet, what about unreason? Warman's Gestures and Attitudes does not specifically feature gestures of madness, but it does include poses of anguish across a spectrum of intensity. Delsarte identifies the gesture of raising one's hands by or above the head to represent anguish, strongest form. He instructs the actor doing this pose to, quote, clasp the hands still more tightly and drop the head still lower as the hands are raised higher. Make sure that the movement of the head is simultaneous with the movement of the hands, end quote. In the Delsarte system of dramatic expression, Stebbins uses a system of abbreviations to categorize the gestural movements as developed and identified by Delsarte. Quote, EX is an abbreviation of eccentric, con for concentric, NOR for normal, end quote. There are several actions notated as XX or eccentric, including exaltation of passion, repulsion, painful passion, terror, fear, vital and mental force exalted, and madness. As in Bernique's book, emotions are enumerated alongside psychiatric states. In Eloquent Gestures, the transformation of performance style in the Griffith Biograph films, Roberta Pearson argues that the underlying principles of the Delsarte method may be seen in Biograph films made between 1908 and 1913, a time frame that overlaps with what cinema scholars consider to be the transitional period of the silent era. Pearson identifies this as an evolution from the histrionic to verisimilar code in U.S. silent film acting, and suggests that Delsartean methods and Biograph acting share a similar semiotic approach to gestures based on the, quote, overall principles of histrionically coded acting, end quote. In Pearson's analysis, while the Delsarte method uses gestures to signify thoughts and emotions, it utilizes a flow of signification, not a one-to-one representation between gesture and meaning. She highlights the variable of time, claiming that actors held poses long enough to be read by the spectator. This idea of gesture containing both flow and stasis is echoed in Laura Mulvey's 2015 essay, Cinematic Gesture, The Ghost and the Machine, which discusses the idea of the gesture itself as a kind of freeze frame or liminal state. Quote, the body caught in gesture occupies a space and time of its own, just as the fragment is detached from narrative linearity or the logic of cause and effect, end quote. How might this intersect with embodied gestures of mental distress or loss of reason? Is the subject's manipulation of time altered? Does the signifying gesture have a different relationship with meaning, as is sometimes seen in people with aphasia? These questions of gap and flow are especially interesting when applied to one of the core methods recommended in printed materials from the 1910s and early 1920s for learning the craft of screen acting. Guides to performing before the motion picture camera first emerged in the US and England in the early 1910s, coinciding with training programs for screen acting. Many of these schools were spurious at best. For example, in an advertisement in the July 1912 Motion Picture Story magazine, Taylor's Theatrical Enterprises guarantees complete training for the stage or motion pictures, alongside coursework in vaudeville and musical comedy. Taylor's, which under a slightly different name and just a few months prior focused on the production of novelty slides for singers, claimed that it was the only school teaching you every branch of the motion picture business, complete courses in motion picture acting, photoplay writing, moving picture machine operating, and piano playing for pictures, special correspondence course in photoplay writing. By 1916, Taylor's was out of business, but there were plenty of new programs to take its place. Chris O'Rourke describes the rise of bogus cinema schools in England in his essay On the First Rung of the Ladder of Fame, Would-Be Cinema Stars in Silent Era Britain, noting that reformers attacked the schools without evidence as recruitment centers for prostitution rings. Young women were the target consumer for both fan magazines and acting schools, and O'Rourke outlines a parallel in England to Shelley Stamp's influential work on the subject of U.S. movie-struck girls. O'Rourke notes the irony of 1920s fan magazines turning against cinema schools, quote, given their own active involvement in advertising such services over the preceding decades, end quote. Screen acting instruction texts from the 1910s and 1920s should be seen within the context of economic enticement circulating on both sides of the glossy paper. In film acting handbooks published between 1913 and 1921 in the US and England, the predominant acting method prescribed is to practice expressions in front of a mirror. Francis Agnew advises against simply assuming postures. Quote, it is not enough to say that the brows contract, eyes glare, and lips are pressed together in anger, or a mournful look. In the depths of the eyes, the mouth drooping denotes grief and despair. She sounds, end quote, she sounds nearly Stanislavskian when clarifying her take on finding motivations for signifying gestures. These are merely principles for expressions which have no depth of sincerity unless impelled by intense feeling. To engage with such feeling through empathy, Agnew recommends that the novice actor imagine scenarios and enact the role that corresponds best to their type before a mirror. The story is to be told by the expressions of the face and the attitudes of the body. While she lists madness among the emotions and sentiments to study, she does not specify how someone who is mentally stable might, quote, get in sympathy, end quote, with a subject who is in psychiatric distress or has lost the ability to distinguish what is in their mind from what is occurring around them. The emphasis on physical type and observing outward expression in the mirror contradict a method for expressing mania with sincerity. Agnew recommends critical observation of actors on screen as a second form of photoplayer education, a method carried to the extreme in Jean Bernique's 1916 motion picture Acting for Professionals and Amateurs, which features 499 stills from current films, identifying the emotions. Bernique advises consulting the film synopses to better appreciate the images, suggesting that, Quote, a careful study of the pictured expressions of these screen stars will, with diligent practice before a mirror, furnish the beginner in filmland an excellent groundwork. Do not pass over these hastily. She explains that a film actor may be asked to assume an expression on the spot by a director, so should study a broad range as preparation, lest it lead to disappointment. He is pleased or incited to blankety blank, according to the manner in which the emotions are stimulated. Daily mirror exercises are likely recommended by British authors in two 1921 booklets, Dangerfield and Howard's How to Become a Film Artiste, The Art of Photoplay Acting, and in Practical Hints on Acting for the Cinema. Agnes Platt advises covering the lower part of the face with a handkerchief so that the actor might practice eye expressions before the glass and even strengthen the muscles of the eyelids. In 1916, Hugo Munsterberg proselytized, to picture emotions must be the central aim of the photoplay. This idea is echoed in the acting instruction booklets and articles that emerged contemporaneously with Munsterberg's The Photoplay, and in the acting text. And the acting text also shared his belief in unity. Jean Bernique argues that films must not be abruptly interfered with by superfluous stunts, idealistic beauties, stage stars, and elaborate settings. The story must be told by consistent action and subtle expression of simulated emotions. Sam Schlappich dismisses the ranting, which is more burlesque than physical expression and should always be avoided as it is always avoidable. Harking back to Siddons's advice against disgusting imitations of madness a century before her, Agnes Platt writes, quote, remember that anything exaggerated is likely to defeat its purpose and take the jump from the sublime to the ridiculous. Cultivate discretion in this as in anything else, end quote. How much of this anti-ridiculous or anti-burlesque position was influenced by systemic racism or classism? Well, expressions of mental distress do find their way into early screen acting literature in the menu of emotions to practice. The emphasis on making feelings visible yet decorous served to perpetuate very old beliefs in what madness looks like without addressing methods for how an actor might ethically or truthfully enact such distress. Thank you.